Well, thank you all very, very much for coming. This is actually, as you know, many of you have been to our other sessions this morning with Erica Greeter and Ben Domenech, and I hope all of you got to see the extraordinary speech by Senator Ted Cruz at lunch today. This year, for those of you who don't know, and most of you do at this point, this Media Day is something different for us. In the past 24 months, the Texas Public Policy Foundation has undergone a revolution in communications and media affairs. We have become larger, more prominent, and more active in national media than ever before, and we're very proud of that. And so, as a consequence of that, today, the third day, prequel, as it were, to policy orientation, we are focusing on the movement in the media, and that's what we have our esteemed panelist, Jonah Goldberg, here to have a conversation on. To introduce Jonah, Jonah, I struggled with what to do by way of introducing you, and tried to think of some witty quote or some very obscure incident from history to introduce you. But the most appropriate thing I could think of, and you will appreciate this, Jonah's role in the movement, for those of you who don't know him, and if you don't know him, don't admit it because it makes you look ill-informed. He actually is one of the most marvelous conservative commentators on the scene today, and I'll tell you why. More than, and this is not to be disputatious with anyone else in the movement, but I consider him to be one of the premier intellectual historians in the United States today. Now, intellectual history is a topic that is typically A, quite boring, and B, attacked by left-wing professors ensconced in ivory towers somewhere. Jonah Goldberg does something different. He gets out there and talks to the American public and explains the nature of ideas, how they change, and how they are inherited in American public life. And you can tell it works because the other side hates him. His book, Liberal Fascism, which was a great book, and you all should get out your smartphones surreptitiously, pretend like you're still listening, and order it. It's worth reading. And the reason it's worth reading is this. It makes very clear what we already knew, which is that the other side, the statists, the big government crowd, are really heirs to an anti-freedom agenda. And what liberal fascism did was contextualize that in an American context. A brilliant read, The Tyranny of Cliches, which came out in May of last year, I believe, similarly good, talked about how liberals use thought-terminating cliches to end debate. That's the opposite of what we do at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're for debate, we're for discourse with all comers, and Jonah Goldberg is a marvelous exemplar of exactly how that works. Now, the conservative movement, I will say this and then we will start the conversation with Jonah, is in a bit of a no-win scenario at the moment. After the 2012 elections, it often seems that things are dim and that the other side is winning the game. But, Jonah, as you know, as a student of military history, there is the famous Kobayashi Maru test, which is administered. So those of you who laughed have just exposed yourselves as people who did not do much in high school. The Kobayashi Maru test, by the way, is, I'm bringing it up in homage to one of the commonalities, probably the only thing in common that Jonah and I have. He's intelligent, I'm illiterate. But we both love Star Trek. And in Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru test is the no-win scenario that Starfleet officers are subjected to see how they deal with defeat. And there are great moral lessons there, because in defeat, you figure out how to win. And that's really the question before the conservative and liberty-oriented movements today. And with that, we're going to talk about media and the movement. Please join me in welcoming National Review Online's founding editor and American Enterprise Institute fellow, Jonah Goldberg. Now, Jonah, you are the founding editor of National Review Online, related to, but not the same as National Review. NRO likely is read by most of you with computers and electricity. Tell us a little bit about that experience, and I would be very interested in your broader thoughts, using that as a jumping off point, on the building of institutions for conservative thought and conversation. Because that's something that our side doesn't always do as well as it ought to.
Sure. First of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here. I'm happier than Helen Thomas at a Hamas rally. I want to thank these guys for having me down here. This is my first time to Austin, and not the best introduction to it, but so far I smoked a cigar outside the Weatherman convention across the street. but I've always wanted to come here, and I'm a big fan of TPPF. That's how I'm supposed to say it. And,
yes, sir. Thank you.
One of the things I like about state-based think tanks is they're sort of like the Christian monasteries in Ireland during the Dark Ages. They would keep the flame of civilization alive until the ignorant masses were ready to receive the word. And places like this really do a fantastic job of fighting where a lot of the fight really has to happen at the local level, And I'm a huge champion of federalism. I think, and I can do the math on a chalkboard. Federalism is the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness, because it allows the most people to live the way they want to live. And one of the things the conservative movement lacked up until about 20, 30 years ago was any of these sorts of outposts out on the frontier, as it were. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of one of the conservative institutions that you're talking about. In terms of NRO, look, NRO was a lot of it was happenstance. I was lucky. I had some great support from the folks at National Review. I remember when we were having the first meetings about National Review Online, back when the internet was new and was still running on pneumatic tubes.
Right after Al Gore invented it, actually.
That's right, yeah. You could still find his initials on a lot of the inner workings of the internet back then. We had this meeting, and I remember, the publisher at the time, Ed Capano, saying, look, William F. Buckley has always said that the mission of National Review is the mission. And National Review is just a bunch of paper that we put out that helps it advance the mission. If it comes to a day where we no longer have a magazine, we're simply on the internet, that's fine, because what matters is the mission and not how you convey it. And I always thought that was a pretty impressive thing for a magazine that was that conservative, to be willing to contemplate the idea of losing the magazine for the sake of the mission. And anyway, the NRO started, it was fortuitous. At the beginning of the internet, no one really knew what was going on. And the one thing that National Review had better than anybody else in that space was a brand name. And brand names really matter, particularly on the internet. Back then, you could search on the web and find any crazy crackpot website, and it looked as legitimate as any other website. And you didn't know. You didn't know if you could trust it. Was this being done by some sweaty guy in his attic with a whole bunch of decapitated Barbie dolls, or was this like a real thing? And National Review had this name. Everyone knew National Review stood for something. Mm-hmm. It had carved out this space. And so while I'm perfectly delighted to take as much credit as I possibly can, I was and remain, in a very conservative understanding of things, standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's one of the wonderful things about conservatism, is that we understand our indebtedness to previous generations. We understand the importance of the ideas of the past, and how that just simply because something is old doesn't mean it's not right, which is the completely different psychological orientation of the left. And so, when we started it, we didn't know what was going to happen. I was originally writing this weird online diary, walking around my apartment in my underwear trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And it was a diary about the impeachment stuff and the Lewinsky scandal and all that. It was called the Goldberg File. And it got very popular, and about 3 months into doing that, Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, and the former publisher at Capano said, Jonah, we're thinking about turning the website into an actual sister magazine. We wondered if you wanted to take it over. And the reason why a lot of people get their great starts in life, had nothing better to do. And so I said, sure. And back then, I remember I was taking dictation from Larry Kudlow as he was phoning in his columns to me and all that kind of stuff. And it just grew by leaps and bounds. And some of it had to do with the institutional structure of National Review being a controversy about what to call it, a fortnightly, a semi-weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly. It came out every 2 weeks. We had a big enough staff that we could dedicate to the online operation, where weeklies still couldn't figure out how to do that.
Sure.
So we got a really big head start. I'll tell you, one of the things that was really groundbreaking for us was the creation of Opinion Group, which I was terrified at the time. I was still running NRO back then, and I remember calling my dad, who was a media guy, professionally, And I was saying, this is terrible. I feel like, I have the hardware store that has two kinds of nails, rusty and not rusty. And Home Depot's moving in across the street. And my dad said, that's exactly the wrong way to look at it. The way to look at it is you don't want to be in any business where a bunch of people who are smarter than you have looked at it and said, that's a really stupid idea. You want to be in a business where everyone looks at what you're doing and says, wow, why did they think of that first? And what Opinion Journal helped do was legitimize online opinion journalism in a way. It's sort of like when I have a friend who owned a small coffee shop, and he always used to say how he loved Starbucks. The reason he loves Starbucks is without Starbucks, you don't educate the consumer to be willing to pay $3 for a cup of coffee. And without sort of Opinion Journal, you don't have a marketplace that's willing to say writing stuff online is worthwhile. And then the thing sort of took a life of its own. My conception of NRO was always to sort of take what was best about the history of National Review, but update it a little bit. The reputation that National Review had was, and I've been reading it since I was 12 years old because I'm that cool, was...
It's pretty cool.
Latin puns and Chesterton quotes. And so I wanted to bring in Star Trek and all that kind of stuff and appeal to sort of office workers in what I used to call their veal pens, their cubicles.
Sure. Yeah.
I remember in the first year, we decided to sell T-shirts, which had my name on them, which was really embarrassing. And the vendor called National Review and said, we have never moved so many T-shirts. And then we're like, wow, this is great. And then he finished the sentence, which was, in extra, extra large to the south. I was like, oh, that's different. But one of the things that NRO allowed us to do was, National Review's readership had skewed very Midwestern and very old. And NRO's readership skewed very coastal and very young. And that was a very important thing for, I think, both for the cause and for the magazine generally, in terms of fixing that, reaching a new generation. Sort of, this isn't your father's National Review.
Not just a new generation, but really an entirely new market, it sounds like.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So the story that you're telling here is, which is interesting to me, so far the two brand names that we've talked about are National Review and the Wall Street Journal, via Opinion Journal, which is a bit contrary, and so I'd be curious as your thoughts on this to sort of what the internet tells itself, right? Which is that all these new radio, Salon, for example, or Slate. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the proper reaction. These online brands that establish themselves, and so I'm curious what you think of the legacy institutions versus sort of the new web-only endeavors. Keeping in mind that we live in an era right now where Newsweek is dead and General Motors is alive, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure Obama thought about writing a check to Newsweek. At least for back pay for the previous coverage he got.
It's an Andrew Sullivan subscription now, actually.
Part of the thing to keep in mind is that conservatives have always had this advantage with new technologies. In part because the old technologies were so dominated by these media monopolies. And so whether it was direct mail with Richard Viguerie and all of that, or VHS distribution, which was a big part of conservative direct mail stuff back in the day, or AM talk radio. I mean, Rush Limbaugh, before AM talk radio was truly going the way of the Pleistocene era, and then Rush Limbaugh basically revived the entire medium, in large part because there's this huge untapped market that knew what it was hearing from this 1 square mile in Midtown New York was wrong, but there was no place to have it explained why it's wrong. And that was sort of one of the great things that Rush did. I mean, I'm not necessarily a ditto head, but I marvel at about that contribution and what things like National Review Online and sort of blogging culture generally did was allow for the going around of those mainstream institutions in a way that no one could ever have imagined before. And now what we're seeing is that basically the Huns have overrun, the mainstream institutions, and they're coming apart. I think that there there are probably mid-sized chains of fast food restaurants in Indiana that are worth more than the New York Times now. In terms of the narrative that the internet tells itself, I was always a little skeptical of it. You know, look, I mean, talk about intellectual history a little bit. There's this great passage in de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was a huge fan of newspapers. Mm-hmm. And he says, you know, I'm totally butchering the quote, but getting the gist of it. You know, the backbone of America is association, by which he meant civil society, free association, the Burkean little platoon stuff. And the backbone of associations are newspapers. And what a lot of people don't really appreciate is that the era we're moving into now is much more contiguous and normal and natural with the history of American media than what we've grown up with. There was this great parenthesis. You have this generation starting with the New Deal, or really we're starting with World War I, but then really in earnest with the New Deal, and then with the advent of television and that generation that comes back from war, they were company men. It was a generation institutionalized at a very fundamental level to listen to authority, to listen to big institutions.
Sure.
And then you have TV come along with only 3 channels, and everyone sort of paid homage to these giant institutions, and it is because of the legacy of electronic media, starting with the telegraph, and then radio, and then really TV, that you got this idea of objective journalism. This idea that if you just put the camera on something,
sure, or
the microphone at something, you don't need interpretation. You're just reporting the actual event as it's happening to people. And so you had this myth of objectivity that overtook American journalism for about 2 generations, that people only in the last decade or 2 have realized was always a fraud. And it's funny, if you look at Europe, newspapers have always been biased, right? I mean, the Times of London is Tory, the Telegraph is conservative, the Guardian is left-wing, you know, you can go down the list, not to touch on unpleasant subjects.
Yeah,
it doesn't mean they're necessarily bad journalistic institutions, but they're honest about what their biases are. But the core point I'm trying to make is that media was always associated with communities. It was a way to communicate information that specific communities wanted. And with the rise of the internet, you're having a return to that. Where, you know, it used to be that political parties used to put out their own newspapers. And that's why you have the Arkansas Democrat. You know, that was the name of a newspaper.
Indeed.
And because people had this association, it was for like-minded people to get their information. And that's what the internet has wrought, is that we're sort of returning to that norm. And the idea of objective journalism is being taken down a couple pegs, which I think is, for the most part, helpful.
So let me channel many journalists I've met, and I won't name names because they're well-meaning individuals. But when it's pointed out to them that this state of affairs is in fact a reversion to the historical norm, and that what we see, there's a lot of meaningful parallels between the blogs and the internet culture of the last decade and say the pamphleteering of the 1790s through really the First World War, basically. You tell them that, and the response is, paraphrasing, well, we're trading Walter Cronkite for Ezra Klein and Erik Erikson. How do you answer that?
Well, first of all, I'm of the mind that Walter Cronkite was vastly overrated.
Acknowledged. Yes.
And I mean, look, Walter Cronkite's a good example of what I'm talking about. This idea of objectivity that so suffused journalistic culture. Walter Cronkite ended his every newscast with the tagline, "And that's the way it is," right? That there was no room for a difference of opinion or epistemological uncertainty of any kind. It was like, this is the voice, and Hugh Hewitt, who created a lot of that news culture, is the founder of 60 Minutes and one of the original producers back then.
Hugh Downs.
No, Hugh Hewitt was the creator of 60 Minutes.
Oh, sorry,
yeah,
please.
Right. Hugh Downs now does some really strange infomercial stuff lately.
Indeed.
But he used to call those anchors the voices of God. That was his term for that job description. And so while we can argue about whether or not replacing Walter Cronkite with Erik Erikson or Ezra Klein is an adequate trade or a good analogy, moving beyond, you know, the realm where those nightly news broadcasts had a stranglehold on what was permissible to believe or what facts were relevant, I think is a good thing. Remember, bring up fascism. What's his name? Daniel Shore, who passed away a few years ago after working on NPR for a long time. But in the 1960s, he was the chief foreign correspondent for the CBS Evening News. And in 1964, Barry Goldwater went on vacation in Germany, in Europe. And part of his tour was to go to Germany. And Daniel Shore went on the CBS Evening News and told the American people that Barry Goldwater's trip to Germany was really a clandestine effort to meet up with neo-Nazi elements to coordinate the fall campaign. And you could not conceivably get away with that kind of crap today. And that's a good thing. That said, you do get echo chamber problems. And I'm the first to stipulate that. I talk to college students a lot. And the first thing I tell them is, if you're only reading people you agree with, you've got a problem. You should really try to read some of what the other guys do too. And some of it isn't just because it's liberal doesn't necessarily mean it's bad journalism. The New York Times. Look, I grew up in a family where it was a matter of religious dogma to be driven batty by the New York Times. I mean, I remember my dad being worked up into a sweat every time the New York Times referred to Fidel Castro as Dr. Castro. And NPR, too, is obviously liberal, but it's also pretty good. And if you're an informed news consumer, you can filter out some of that stuff. Indeed. But there's also good reporting that goes on there. And whether you like it or not, a lot of good and decent people out there are listening to it. And if you don't know what they're listening to, you're not going to be empowered or equipped to explain to them why they should be skeptical of it. And so I'm all for an informed citizenry, but there's a tendency on the right and the left to simply find the sources that reconfirm your existing prejudices and biases, and that's a problem for any movement.
And that's a perfect segue into what I would like to ask you next, which is movement institutions in the 2012 election cycle. Now, we've discussed, and many of you in the audience are aware, that since the Obama administration came to power in January 2009, there's been substantive efforts to develop alternative media, alternative institutions, explicitly conservative outlets to interpret the world. Arguably, and this is a bit of an unfair critique, but it is a critique that's delivered and I think needs to be answered. A lot of them failed in the 2012 cycle. There were a lot of people genuinely surprised that Benghazi, for example, didn't sway people en masse to go out and vote Mitt Romney the next president of the United States. Where did it go wrong?
Well, just take a step back for a second. This raises, I think, a really important, look, I am all in favor of conservatives starting up conservative papers on college campuses. I'm all in favor of starting new conservative magazines and websites like 1,000 Flowers Bloom. I think that is all healthy and good, up until a point. I'll give you an example. Look, I love Hillsdale College. I do a lot of fundraising work for Hillsdale College. I think they do fantastic work. I think it is a wonderful liberal arts college that teaches things that a lot of more famous liberal arts colleges don't teach anymore. Great books and all of that. They do wonderful things. I would rather see 5 more conservative faculty members at Harvard than 5 more Hillsdale colleges. Because at the end of the day, it's our culture too. And if you talk to a generally non-political, but probably Republican, even conservative orthodontist from Bloomington, Indiana, he's going to want his daughter or his son to go to Harvard because it's Harvard. And there's one thing that conservatives should understand better than liberals is that you cannot create new, old institutions. And we desperately need, and this is something where, I don't know how many fat cat donors are in the room, but if you sit on the board of a university or a college, I'm always amazed. I was the young trustee of my college. I'm always amazed at these incredibly tough, serious people, these CEOs and businessmen and investment bankers who wouldn't brook stupidity from their staff for a heartbeat. They turn into mewling kittens when they see some guy with elbow patches show up and tell them that they need a new, women's studies professor. And, the culture war is a door-to-door fight. And the idea that somehow the conservatives who actually love America as it is should be the ones to surrender America, the institutions that make America America, is sort of an outrage. You know, it was Barack Obama remember in 2008, Barack Obama said, we're just days away from fundamentally transforming America. And he used to talk all this time about fundamentally transforming America. And yet, if you ever questioned his patriotism in any way, you know, that was just verboten. And you know, but the thing is, if you understand what patriotism is, and there are lots of definitions, at the end of the day, patriotism is nothing if it is not love of country. And you cannot love something unless you love it to a certain significant degree as it is, right? Because, I mean, try it this way. Go home, men in the room, go home tonight, and you see your wives. Say, honey, I love you, I think you're fantastic, I just want to fundamentally transform you. And see how they take it, right? If you love something solely for what it could be, rather than for what it is, that's not love, it's lust. And so much of what runs through liberalism is really a lust for power, a lust to fundamentally transform things. Meanwhile, Americans actually kind of like, you know, conservatives actually kind of like America as it is. It doesn't mean conservatives don't believe in reform or improvement. Russell Kirk, you know, and Edmund Burke, they write eloquently about all of that. But they don't believe that the whole thing needs to be thrown out and transformed. And part and parcel of that belief means trying to take back some of these institutions. It means going to Hollywood and trying to take back Hollywood rather than trying to recreate your own conservative Hollywood someplace else and put out agitprop. And so, you know, and this sort of gets at the fundamental point that I keep trying to make to young conservatives is that conservatism has to be about persuasion. It has to be about persuading people who disagree with you. Otherwise, it's like a Dungeons and Dragons club or a Civil War reenactment society, where, you know, we all just, you know, get to talk about the things we all agree on, and we'll, you know.
I don't want to be seen disparaging any of those, though.
Yeah, no, I understand. No, to be sure. But there's one of the problems of conservatism faces are most of the problems that conservatism faces are problems of success. You know, Fox News, whatever its flaws, and I'm a Fox News contributor, whatever its flaws is a huge advance for conservatism. I mean, if you told someone 25 years ago, we're going to have a right-leaning news network that will be the single highest rated news network on all of cable, you would think that would be awesome, right? You know, but at the same time, because of things like Fox, because of the breadth and depth of the conservative movement, the conservative identity out there, you have the capacity to have an entire career of only talking to audiences that agree with you. And you can make a very nice living only talking to audiences that agree with you. And you can actually get to the point, as some people on the right have, of not actually, I mean, I don't want to get too nasty about it, but where the line between trying to make the country better and just trying to stir up trouble to line your own pockets gets blurrier and blurrier. And that's a problem. I mean, I have no problem. I'm a conservative, you know, what has two thumbs and likes capitalism, this guy. But I have no problem with people getting rich and being successful. But there is a there's a strain inside of movement conservatism today that is about personal enrichment rather than actually winning battles. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people have to deal with. And that's why I think, like the Texas Public Policy Foundation and and the American Enterprise Institute, where I'm at, one of the things I like about these places, even if I'm not too adept at it, is they're actually making serious public policy arguments about the facts and the numbers and the budget and all of this, rather than a lot of emotional stuff that isn't necessarily constructive. And I think there are trade-offs to be made.
And so we get, I'm interested in digging in a little bit deeper, and I won't push you farther than you want to go on it, but the strain, the facets of personal enrichment as the end goal of one's involvement in the movement. I mean, these are individuals, institutions that benefit from the status quo, are they not? I mean, these are not individuals that benefit from the change that we might want to see in the world.
Yeah, there are many legitimate and serious positions that come down on this recent fiscal cliff nonsense,
Indeed.
right? And it was such an ungodly mess that the Republican Party found itself in, that nobody is pure, nobody is, there were no good options in all of that. But there was a strain out there of a lot of people who basically wanted to, there was this idea that like Republicans they can't be seen as voting for a tax increase, and if they refuse to vote for a tax increase, we'll win. And so there were all this there's a lot of chatter out there like, first we'll stand on principle. We have a 3-step program. Step 1, stand on principle. Step 2, question mark, question mark, question mark. Step 3, total victory. And if you could fill in step 2 for me, I'm totally with you. But there are a lot of people who wanted to be able to rant about step 1 and step 3 without providing anything for step 2. And you have people like Dick Morris, who is a very smart man. He comes on a lot of National Review cruises. People love him. He's very popular with a lot of people. But, I am not at all convinced that Dick Morris's primary concern is conservative legislative victories, rather than it's getting people to send him another check so he can allegedly put out another ad someplace that no one's ever seen. I think Fox was right to say maybe we've had a little bit too much of you. And I think that some of that stuff just goes a little too far.
So we're here, January 2013. The president's been reelected. We do have a conservative media universe that's been established and nurtured to a certain extent. NRO obviously being a pioneer, Opinion Journal being a pioneer, and then we've had the Breitbart network online in the past several years. There's the, whatever we're calling the Malkin Empire, various Red State, for example. What's next? What does the winnowing out process look like? And I'm not asking you to predict which specific institutions rise and fall, but where do we as a movement go in our institution building? I mean, do we, having poured the effort and energy into, and look, I'm a Red State co-founder.
Right.
We established it to talk to our own. But at this point, having arrived at where we're at, is it time to scatter forth into the world and do other things? Have we had enough of our own thing?
Well, no, I would prefer a strategy of both and rather than either or. I mean, I would hate to see Red State or the Breitbart universe or Michelle's stuff fold up shop. I don't think that would be a good idea. And full disclosure, I mean, Andrew Breitbart was a dear friend of mine, and I worry about, as I would any institution that lost sort of the visionary guy, what will happen to his operation now that he's gone. But I think any source of energy, any place that can rally the troops is a worthwhile thing. It's just that, it's not its own reward. I mean, there has to be, and now what? And the ultimate goal is to have the next generation kids grow up reading things like National Review Online and Red State and all these things. And then instead of their dream being to get a job at Red State, their dream being to get a job at the Washington Post. And liberals are far smarter about this stuff than we are, and partly because it's a lot easier for them to do it, because they control these institutions. They control those commanding heights. But it drives me absolutely crazy. The New Republic and the American Prospect and Washington Monthly and Mother Jones, these are all very ideological magazines. No problem with ideological magazines. I like ideological magazines. I think they're in many ways better than objective news magazines. But these are the farm teams for the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, if you put in 3-4 years at the New Republic, almost guaranteed you can get a job as a straight reporter at the New York Times or at the Washington Post. You put in 3 or 4 years at National Review, and you've basically guaranteed you will never have your phone calls returned by the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so look, if someone out there wants to start, a Washington Times for, that's a little more serious about what it's going to do and doesn't have some of the baggage it had with the Mooney stuff and all of that, that would be great. But that newspaper or that TV show or that media outlet, whatever it is, has to be aimed at Americans, not just at conservatives, because that's the next stage. And part of the problem is that because of the way the internet works and the new media landscape works, it doesn't look like there are going to be any more new institutions like that, or not very many. I mean, the Examiner is a sort of a counterexample to that, which is an actual newspaper that I think has a pretty good business model. But for the most part, I mean, as a syndicated columnist, it's a source of deep frustration for me. I always wanted to be, George Will or, William Safire. There aren't going to be any more George Wills or William Safires. And, and that's just basically because the model, the business model of being a syndicated columnist is completely imploded. I feel like, Frodo, I made it almost into Mordor and the whole thing just sort of collapses around me, that whole thing has just simply blown up, and it's just because there aren't enough newspapers out there. It used to be you had these competitive pressures of 2 and 3 and 4 newspaper towns, where a salesman could go and say, "Hey, would you like to buy George Will? We'd love George Will. We'd love to have George Will. How much does he cost? $200 a week." And they would say, "Oh, that's a little too steep for me." He says, "Okay, I'll go across the street and try to sell it to them." Now there's no one across the street. There just isn't. If there are newspapers left, they're in one newspaper town, with the exception of New York City. And so the editor says, "We love George Will, I'll give you $5. And the salesman goes, "Okay, sure."
Only game in town.
Only game in town. And because of the internet, it used to be the syndicates provided an actual physical service. They knew how to get copy from the San Francisco Chronicle to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And back in the days before the internet, that was actually physically difficult. That was a real skill. You had to actually get, by telegraph or by mail or by someone calling in over the phone, get that copy to a newspaper a continent away. Now, if you want to read Tom Sowell, it's not like you have to find him in your local paper. You just type in Tom Sowell and he pops up on Town Hall or wherever, or National Review Online, which is where you should read it. And that's just deflationary. And so that model is gone. And I talk to journalism students a lot, and I always tell them this is the most exciting time ever to go into journalism, ever. The only problem is we don't know how to pay for it, and that's a real problem. And you try to remind people, the reason why Edward R. Murrow and Hugh Hewitt and Hugh Downs and all those guys went into television in the early 1950s, because they couldn't get decent jobs in radio. No one knew what television was back then. It was the internet of its time. People were trying everything. And I love all these people who talk about like the corruption of advertising and all that. Go back and watch some of these like Mike Wallace interviews.
Oh,
right?
sure.
So you can find him on YouTube and stuff. He's talking to like U Thant, the former head of the UN or something, and he'll say, "I want to get back to you about this question of Formosa, but first we have to take a break." And they'll just turn to another camera and say, "When I'm preparing for an interview like this, nothing relaxes me more than the cool, refreshing taste of menthols unfiltered, whatever," and starts smoking right into the camera, and it's to put it in terms of a journalistic example, James O'Keefe, whatever his successes or mistakes might have been, he basically is using the exact same techniques that put 60 Minutes on the map. I mean, they did hidden cameras to bust people, and they won Peabodys and Pulitzers for it. And then a conservative starts doing it, and it's outrageous and unethical. But the beauty of the technological transformation is that if you have an iPhone, you have at your disposal technology that it used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to procure. And you have platforms that didn't exist. And so we're raising a bunch of incredibly intrepid, smart, energetic, young conservative journalists out there who are doing some fantastic stuff. The trick is to figure out how we can give them a career path that makes them want to stay in it and raise a family. Because that's one of the reasons why conservatives historically haven't gone into journalism, is because it's not a really great, well-paying career. And if you're conservative, there are all these biases against you. And now you can stay conservative and be a good reporter and a good journalist. The problem is that the financial structure is sort of falling apart, and if I could figure out how to solve that, I would be a wealthy man.
Well, as would we all. The one last question, then we'll go to audience questions. So get your questions ready. I'm just curious. This is a bit out of left field, but I want your take on it. Why is AM talk the only sphere in which the left has not been able to gain much purchase?
Well, this is a great question. My own theory about it is that AM talk, well, let's put it this way, there's a reason why stand-up comedy is overwhelmingly dominated by blacks, gays, Canadians, and Jews. And the reason, I'm serious, it's like something like 90% of them, if you start doing the math, fall into one of these categories. And the reason for it is that you need to be sort of an outsider insider, right? You need to be part of the mainstream culture, but also sort of up against the fishbowl looking into it. And the sort of the same thing applies. I mean, talk radio isn't necessarily stand-up, but it's a cousin.
It's an entertainment medium.
And what talk radio lets you do is make fun of and poke holes in the reigning pieties of our age. You know, make fun of what the New York Times said today. Make fun of what, you know, was on CBS last night. Make fun of what they're teaching in colleges today. And because conservatives are outsiders to all of that. And it gives us this sort of, we're Americans, but we're also sort of outside of that mainstream elite culture, liberal elite culture. And so we have just such a target-rich environment. The problem is if you're a liberal, right, then you have to, because of political correctness and all the rest, you have to pay fealty to the coalition of the oppressed. You can't make fun of anybody except Mormons and rich white evangelicals. And there's just not enough people who want to listen to those jokes over. It's just not enough material. And so talk radio lets people who want to hear a better and more articulate explanation for why they think so much of what is being passed off as the smart and right thing is a bunch of BS. And left-wingers can't do that unless they're really left, unless they're crazy Marxists or conspiracy theorists or whatever. Left-wingers can't do that because they actually have deep and abiding respect for the Harvard Women's Studies Department. And they think that the Congressional Black Caucus is the conscience of the Congress, which I think is like the most ludicrous thing imaginable. And so they just don't have enough, for all the liberal rhetoric and left-wing rhetoric about who runs this country and who controls things and corporate power and all the rest. The simple fact is that the dominant media, intellectual, literary, and even commercial culture in this country is fundamentally liberal. And you can't do 3 hours a day as an outsider to all of that if you're a liberal. That's my theory.
It's as good as any. Now we'll turn to audience questions. Surely there are some. Do we have anyone who'd like to ask yes, sir, right there. We have a mic. Josiah?
Hope it's not about the Kobayashi Maru.
Well, but if it is, how would deal with death?
Are young people becoming more pro-life, and is the pro-life issue differentiated from other social conservative issues like gay marriage going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up. I was just reading before I came down here. NARAL has officially declared that they want to give up the language of being pro-choice, which is a ancient tactic that the left plays, where the second you actually can hold them accountable to what they actually believe and identify and define their terms in an accurate way, they just change their terms, right? I mean, this is a big part of what my book Tyranny of Cliches was about, you know, is this tendency of, you know, rejecting labels, you know, because the way liberalism works is that they want to be have the maximum room of maneuverability to define themselves as any way they want. And if you actually hold them to their own definitions and their own standards, they squirm and they say, you know, don't do that. Michael Bloomberg actually started a whole group called No Labels, based on this idea that somehow if we just got rid of labels, the country would all of a sudden clamor to have a nebbishy, pain in the ass, petty tyrant, 5'0" Jewish mayor of New York as the president of the United States. But one of the reasons why NARAL did this is that the country is moving pro-life for a bunch of different reasons. And this is one of the things I like to point out to conservatives. Conservatives love this slippery slope stuff that today is worse than yesterday, and yesterday was worse than the day before. But there are real successes. You know, if you had predicted 20 years ago that the country would move to be more pro-life and pro-gun, but also more pro-gay. People say that's ridiculous, but that's what's happened. And personally, of those three, I will take those. I will take those two out of the three. And I mean, there are people smarter about this than I am. Some of my colleagues at National Review spend a lot of time on the abortion issue. Some of it has to do with technological changes. A lot of it has to do, I think, with the fact that people realize that it's funny, in popular culture, I'll give you an example, right? And this is the thing that drives me crazy. As some of you may know, I'm a TV addict and I've watched way too much TV. On every sitcom where one of the characters gets pregnant, right? One of the female characters, although in Star Trek, never mind. Like when Rachel gets pregnant on Friends, she agonizes about whether she's going to keep the baby. And they always keep the baby. You never had a character on one of these shows get an abortion, right? Unless it's some really sort of heavy-handed, agitprop-y kind of thing. But any mass appeal thing, they don't get abortions. They might lose the baby in a miscarriage and be heartbroken about it, but they don't get an abortion. And the second they decide to have the baby, even though it's still just a tiny little fetus like this, they start giving it a name and talking about it like it's a person and caring deeply about it. And there's just something natural in the culture about that. And so I think that is one of the areas where there has been remarkable success. In other places, guns. I personally believe that as a matter of tactics, even though I'm very sympathetic to libertarianism, I call myself a libertarian, the place to win hearts and minds on college campuses is libertarianism. Libertarianism is the perfect rebellious out for a college kid. Because you get to argue with your professors, you get to be sort of off the liberal playbook and be controversial and all that, but you don't have to judge anybody. You don't harsh anyone's mellow at a party. You be into a three-way or whatever. And that is the place to go, and that's fine. If you're 19 and want to be a libertarian, that's great. You are useful. Your fodder conservatives can work with, because 10 years later, when you're paying taxes and starting a family, you're going to get shockingly more conservative and realize how juvenile some of the libertarian tenets were. And the larger point I would make about young people, and I am not a fetishist of the young, is that I keep trying to explain to them, they are an iPod generation or an iPhone generation that is voting for a post office party. Right? These are people who have their entire lives sort of delivered to them bespoke. They get to choose when they want to watch something, when they want to listen to something, when they want to see something. They can arrange their entire lives through doodads and whatnot. The idea that they should have to do anything on anybody else's schedule and anyone else's terms strikes them as insane. And yet they vote for this one-size-fits-all political philosophy that wants the government to say, you have to do this on Tuesday between 1 and 3. And hopefully at some point we can sort of get through that logjam of cognitive dissonance and explain to them that if they really like their personal freedoms, they're actually going to have to side with the cause of freedom beyond their own selfish personal freedom.
Next question. Anyone else? Yes.
I just want to say, first of all, I'm a huge fan. I follow you on Twitter, and I think you're hilarious. As an intellectual historian, I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. What do you make of the ideological factionism that's currently plaguing the Republican Party?
What do I make of the ideological factionism within the Republican Party? Well, personally, and this is personal, right? Whether it's good for the cause of the movement or the country and all that kind of stuff, we'll get to in a second. I love it. It's why this is what my last book was all about. What I love about conservatism, truly love about it, is that we love our own intellectual history, we love ideas. This idea that liberalism is free thinking and open-minded, and conservatism is dogmatic and closed-minded, completely inverts reality, right? Dogma comes from the Greek, meaning seems good. That which you take for granted, that for which you just, we have this dogmatic faith in gravity. No one questions gravity, right? Liberalism is so obsessed with its own dogmatic understanding of politics that they don't even understand that they're dogmatic. For them, it's just simply about power politics. Government is good when liberals want it, basically. Conservatives, meanwhile, are constantly having these debates about the trade-offs between liberty and order, freedom and virtue, arguing about whether the federal government should do something that's good for everybody or that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom. Federalism versus big government conservatism or compassionate conservatism. And I think it's one of the great and abiding strengths of conservatism that we have these arguments. And so when you talk about ideological factionalism, doesn't bother me much. What bothers me more is the stuff I was alluding to earlier, where people are just protecting their beat, and defending their revenue stream, or are against something not because they disagree with it, but because some personality they don't like is in favor of it. That kind of stuff bugs me because I think it's juvenile. But I would not want to, what I would rather, I think we're fine when it comes to ideas and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. And I think this current mantra that we're hearing about, if we only had Congress, if only conservatives, if the Republicans in Congress weren't rhinos, which first of all is an incredibly stupid term, right? I mean, I'm a rhino in the sense that I'm proud to call myself a conservative. I don't really care that I'm a Republican, right? I mean, Republicans and Democrats are just the names we give to teams that try to win elections. That's the job of the Republican Party, is to win elections for people with the letter R after their name. Conservatives believe in things, right? And so really, you should call them conservatives in name only, but rhino just is more mellifluous or euphonious or something. But so what bothers me is and part of this has to do with the problem with not the leadership, but the followership. And I'm very sympathetic to the Tea Parties and all that. I've spoken to a lot of Tea Party things. But there's this obsession, this anti-establishment obsession on the right these days that just immediately assumes that if the leaders are for it, there must be something wrong with it. They're being cut out of another bad deal. And they have very good reason to be distrustful. I'm not saying they're stupid or silly or naive, but I would much rather, instead of all of this talk about if we only had pure, serious, principled conservatives in Washington, everything would be better. I think we've got enough of those. I know these guys. These guys who were elected in 2010 are pretty serious guys. Anyway, Ted Cruz, I know he comes a little later. He's been a friend of National Review's for years. He's a serious, principled guy. And I like Ted Cruz precisely because what I think he represents is what I think we need more of, which is an emphasis less on the purity of their ideological convictions and more on how smart they are, how strategically adept they are at winning battles, and that's a harder thing to do. It's very hard for the Republican leadership, for good reasons. It's hard for them to earn the trust of their followers because we've been sold out a lot. And the nature of the system in Washington is so rigged against real progress that every time they try their best and come up short, the budget deal in 2011, in the amount of time it took for one newspaper to come out to give you an analysis of what was in the deal, all of the money that we allegedly cut had already been re-borrowed from China. That's nuts. And so I would much rather have a leadership that seemed impure from time to time, but wrapped up consistent conservative victories. That's what matters to me.
We have time for one last question. Do we have anyone out there? Yes. Yes, sir.
I'd like to follow up on the question earlier about youth and young Americans. Back in the 1970s, a lot of young Americans lived through that big mess and either grew into their conservatism or became conservatives because they were led into that by Ronald Reagan. So I think today we're experiencing or getting to the point where we're experiencing a similar mess. Are we going to need somebody like a Ronald Reagan to lead America's youth back into conservatism? And if so, do you see anybody on the horizon who could do that?
The answer to the first part is probably yes. There's in part because conservatives are so obsessed with ideas, we tend to think personality doesn't matter as much as it actually does. Mitt Romney, decent and honorable and nice guy, country would have been far better off if he had won. He hustled his heart out in that race, was not a particularly compelling, charismatic personality. I think that is a fair thing to say. I used to always joke that if you hit mute while you're watching Mitt Romney talk on TV, it looked like what he was saying was, what do I have to do to put you in this BMW today, right? He had basically an authentic inauthenticity problem. He seemed fake, but that was actually him. It's sort of like when you see an alligator for the first time. You're like, dude, there's no way that thing's real. That's fake. That's not an actual alligator. Then you get close, and you see it move, and whoa! Holy crap! It just turns out alligators look fake. Mitt Romney looks like the picture that came with the frame, right? And as a result, the most telling thing out of this election was, they had those exit poll questions, and on who's better to run the economy, Mitt Romney won it running away. Who'd be a better commander-in-chief, Mitt Romney won it. Who would be better about dealing with the debt or whatever, Mitt Romney won it. Who cares more about people like you? Barack Obama won it something like 82 to 18. And that's important in politics. It just simply is part of politics. And so, yeah, we need personalities that actually can speak the vernacular, can win over people, that connect with people. I personally hate this trend in American politics. This idea that somehow concern is the overriding qualification for public office, I think is really problematic and bad for the republic. I remember when Hillary Clinton ran as a carpetbagger, and I will always call her a carpetbagger, in New York State for the Senate. She went around upstate New York saying, the issue isn't who was more qualified, because she wasn't, right? Or who has more experience, she didn't. The issue should be, who is more concerned about the issues you're concerned about? And she won on that nonsense. Which would you rather? A surgeon who does 15 appendectomies a day, but is kind of blasé about it? Or a plumber who's never held a scalpel in his life, but is really concerned about doing it right? So it's a real problem. Do I see any of those guys? Not yet. You can see glimmers of it in people like Rubio and and Ted and Paul Ryan. I personally am a big fan of Bobby Jindal's. At the national stage, he doesn't really seem to show it. But look, for a tiny little Indian dude to get reelected as governor of Louisiana, where they got people in the hinterlands of Louisiana that make the sort of white trash crowd in Florida seem like Etonians. For him to win re-election is a big deal. And so there's something there that he's not really showing at the national level that I would like to see more of. And we should let them do it. Personally, I think, I'm a big fan of Haley Barbour's. Haley Barbour is one of these guys who actually has this kind of personality that you just are kind of drawn to. I would have loved to see him debate Obama. You spent enough money to scald a wet mule. That would have just been awesome, And Mitt Romney was utterly incapable of doing any of that stuff. And that's a particular problem given his personal background and the reputation of Republicans as sort of basically, judgmental investment bankers. That's sort of and that's a really big problem. And so I'm willing to, for a lot of conservatives, I'm pretty down on Chris Christie these days for various and sundry reasons that very most people know. But his model, I think, is actually a very good one. And if he would get his act together, and part of the problem is he's running for governor of New Jersey again, and so he's got to aim at that electorate. But I think that's a very, excuse me, I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I came here. That's a good model, and I think a lot of people would rally to that. And we need more of that. We need people who, I hate to say it, but we need just simply more and better craven politicians. And that's one of the problems of success we have as conservatives, is that we've trained these incredibly smart guys who can talk intelligently about Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, but they can't go out and eat a corn dog at the state fair. And we need to sort of balance those two things, and then surround them with the guys who can talk about Adam Smith and Edmund Burke. We can staff these guys to death. That's not a problem, but we need natural politicians out there, and Reagan was a natural politician.
And with that, sadly, we come to the end of this discussion. But Jonah Goldberg will be back tomorrow morning, so please come for that, discussing the state of the nation and the world. Please join me in a round of applause for Jonah Goldberg.